Welcome back everyone to part 2 of our lecture series on data frames. So from the previous lecture, we learned how to create a data frame from a NumPy array in Python list, as well as how to read in that CSV file tips.csv. Given now that we have this tips data frame, let's go ahead and briefly explain what's going on in this data frame, and then we'll show you some high-level method calls and attributes for a data frame to get an overall understanding of what's inside this data frame. Let's head back to that same Jupyter notebook from last time. Okay, here I am in the Jupyter notebook from last time, and you'll notice here I've already read in this tips.csv file as we discussed previously and set it to this variable df. So when I run this and I just ask for df or I print df, I get back out the result of the data frame. And this data frame is essentially a data set where one waiter recorded information about each tip he received over a period of a few months working in one restaurant. And so this person collected several features or several variables. And we can see here there's 244 rows, and in this case there's 11 columns because I added a couple of kind of artificial columns for analysis later on. But the main columns are the total bill that was paid, the tip left on that bill, the sex of the person who paid, and then whether or not they were a smoker, the day of the week they happened to be dining, the time, whether they were there for lunch or dinner, the size of the party, so were there 2 people there, 3 people there in total, and then price per person, which we could calculate given the total bill versus how many people were there, size, and then we have some kind of artificial data. So if we scroll over to the right, I made up some data which we'll use later on in learning about operations on a data frame, such as the payer name, their credit card number. Again, this is artificial, it's not a real credit card number. And then a payment ID, which is kind of this artificial thing, which we'll show later on when we talk about an index with Pandas DataFrames. But in general, we have each column representing some feature, and then each row representing an instance of a data point. And now what I want to do is show you a couple of attributes and methods that you call off the data frame object itself that gives you some basic information about the entire data frame. The first ones that are really useful is understanding what are my columns and what is my index. So if we come down here, once we have our data frame, we can say df.columns, and note this is an attribute, so there's no parentheses. And this will report back what is essentially a list of the column names as strings. And these are going to be really important later on because we'll actually use these string codes themselves to grab each column as an individual series, or to grab several columns as a subset data frame. So keep in mind, if you ever need to confirm what the string codes are for the columns, which happens often, especially for weirdly spaced columns with some white space that can be tricky to figure out, just call df.columns, and this reports back the columns that are inside the actual data frame. And then, similarly, you can say df.index, and it reports back the values for the index. If they're labeled values, such as state names, it reports back something kind of similar to this. You'll notice that both df.columns and df.index kind of report back this index object. So it shows that Pandas kind of thinks of them similarly, except one's running along the y-axis and one's running along the x-axis, so to speak, of this data frame. And so we can see here that our index is essentially an automatically created range index, where it starts at 0 and stops at 244 with a step size of 1, and we can easily see that over here, 240, step size of 1 is 241, and so on. So it's a specialized range index object. Okay, so now that we understand how to grab the columns and the index, often you'll see me throughout the course call df.head, open and close parentheses, and what this does, it reports back just the first couple of rows in that data frame. That way I don't have to see kind of this large output. Instead, I can quickly analyze the general structure of my data frame. By default, it shows you the first 5 rows, but you can always change this by asking, oh, show me the first 10 rows of the data frame. And so here it accepts an integer value for how many rows you want. Similarly, these are the first 10 rows. You can grab the last rows you want by saying df.tail. By default, it shows you the last 5 rows, but I could have also asked for the last 10 rows. So that's df.head versus df.tail. So we have the head and the tail, and then lastly, let's talk about getting information across the entire data frame. We actually already showed you this method. It's df.info, and this gives you information on how many entries you have, total number of columns, what each column represents, essentially the data type that it's in, whether it's a floating point. Object is basically the way that Pandas reports that this is a string data type, so keep that in mind. And then we have integers, 64-bit, etc. It also shows you, like I mentioned before, how much RAM you're using and how many non-null values you have in that column. We can see here that there are no missing values in this particular data frame. We talk about dealing with missing values later on in the pandas section of the course. Okay, so that's df.info. And finally, we saw a lot of these were numerical values, which means I can actually perform statistical analysis on it. Very simple things like asking what's the mean value in this column, or what's the standard deviation, or what's the minimum versus maximum value, and so on. And I can do this by saying df.describe. And what this does is for the numeric columns, if I call df.describe, it's going to calculate some very simple statistical information. So it reports back the mean, essentially your average value, the count, how many values there were in total. You'll notice each of these has the same count because there's the same number of rows across all of them. None of them were missing any values. So they each have 244 instances. So that's the count. The mean is the average value. So the average bill was $19.07. Average tip was around $3. Average party size was 2.56 people. And then price per person. Something to keep in mind is sometimes these actual attributes or statistical operations don't make sense for the column. So here we have a credit card number, and the credit card number was stored as an integer and not as a string, which means it's technically possible to calculate the average credit card number. Now, does that actually mean anything in real life? Of course not. There's no significance to the average credit card number if you sum them all up and then divide by 244 in this case. So keep in mind that all these values here for the credit card number don't really make sense and are not useful. So later on we'll see how we can kind of drop this column. Okay, next is standard deviation, the minimum value and the maximum value, and then you have the quartiles, essentially the split offs between 25% of the values are below this and 75% are above this. I think the easiest one to understand is the 50% cutoff. This is essentially the median of your data. And what that says is out of the total bills, 50% of them are below 17.79 and 50% of them are above 17.79. So it's just your quartiles, kind of similar to a box plot, which we'll learn about later on in the course. And those are your description values. A quick point I want to show you here is I actually like calling transpose on this. And what transpose does is it essentially transposes the columns to be the index and the index to be the columns. Sometimes I find this easier to read. So if we say transpose here and call it as a method, it will simply transpose the columns versus the index. And you may find that useful for other things on data frames. But keep in mind, this is sometimes useful just to quickly see mean as the column, depending on how you actually want to read your data. Okay, so those are just a couple of methods on gathering overall information on your data frame. Coming up next, we're going to talk about the really important stuff such as selection and indexing, essentially how to retrieve information from a data frame. I'll see you there.